1922, Czechia. A father buried his sons, standing up. The Bohemia Burial Files. The wind swept through the narrow streets of the Bohemian village, carrying whispers that no one wanted to hear. Doors were bolted tight, and shutters rattled as though warning the villagers to stay inside. Something had happened here, something dark, and everyone felt it before they understood it. Bohemia in 1922 was quiet, almost painfully so, a place where life moved slowly, where neighbors knew one another's secrets, or thought they did. But that year, fear began to creep like smoke through the village. The kind of fear that made mothers clutch their children tighter, that made men glance over their shoulders in silence. The story began with a father, not a man of unusual reputation, at least to outsiders. To his neighbors, he was quiet, somber, and alone. But behind closed doors, something twisted, something invisible, had taken root in his home. And one evening, when the sun dipped behind the low hills, the unthinkable happened. At first, no one noticed. It was a subtle absence, a silence where laughter should have been. Children who once played by the riverbank stopped appearing in the streets. Dogs howled at nothing. Windows reflected shadowed figures that weren't there. And when the villagers whispered among themselves, their words carried dread. People spoke of standing graves, though none could bring themselves to say more aloud. Mothers shushed their children before the words escaped, as if even speaking them could summon the horror closer. The father walked among the villagers with an eerie calm, his eyes distant, haunted, yet strangely indifferent to the growing panic. Evenings became unbearable. The wind would moan through the village like voices of the lost. Candles flickered in the windows, casting long, grotesque shadows across cobblestones. Some said the air smelled faintly of earth and decay, though no one dared investigate the source. Every night, someone would catch sight of the father, standing alone by the churchyard, staring at the rows of graves that seemed wrong. Children stopped laughing altogether. Their absence echoed through empty homes, and mothers left bread and water by the door, hoping some divine mercy would protect the ones who were gone. But the village understood. Something had been broken. Not just the father's family, but the fragile thread holding the entire community together. Rumors spread faster than truth. Some said the father had gone mad. Others whispered that the children had committed some unknown sin, punished in a way that no one dared imagine. Every conversation ended with a shiver. Every glance over the shoulder betrayed the same unspoken question. How could this happen? The arrival of outsiders, priests, journalists, investigators, was inevitable. Yet for all their notebooks and cameras, they found only fragments. Broken toys, footprints that led nowhere, and a father who refused to explain. The village watched as strangers tried to piece together what it already knew. But the standing graves were not just soil and wood. They were a signal, a haunting mark of grief and darkness that no one could ignore. By the time winter arrived, a layer of frost covered the cemetery, and the village whispered its story cautiously to outsiders. Still, no one dared go too close. The father's presence lingered like a shadow, a reminder that some horrors could not be buried. And in the silence, the wind carried one final warning. Some secrets are meant to stand forever. The father spoke little, almost never. When he did, his words were slow, careful, weighed with a heaviness that made listeners uncomfortable. Neighbors who tried to reach him found only walls. Walls of grief, walls of fear, walls of something darker they could not name. He had once been a man of routine. Each morning, he tended to his garden, mended fences, and greeted the villagers with a nod. But after the tragedy, he disappeared into his home. Curtains were drawn tight. Smoke rose from the chimney, but no laughter or voices followed. Even the children's absence seemed to amplify the eerie quiet that surrounded him. The mother, too, vanished in her own way. She wandered the village with hollow eyes, muttering fragments of prayers. She cried quietly at night, but the father remained still. In the marketplace, people would whisper about the silent man. Some said he had lost his mind entirely. Others feared something worse, that he knew things no one else could face, things the rest of the village was too frightened to acknowledge. At night, the father's silhouette was visible through the thin curtains, standing at the window, staring at the cemetery. Candlelight flickered across his face, revealing eyes that were hollow, yet alert, eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the dead themselves. Children whispered to each other about seeing him walk the graveyard paths, muttering to himself, or simply staring at the earth as though expecting it to answer. The silence was almost unbearable. Even the wind seemed to bend around his house, carrying away sound, leaving an unnatural calm. Dogs refused to approach. Birds avoided the yard. And when the villagers dared to ask about the children, he would tilt his head, eyes empty, and say nothing. Neighbors began to notice subtle, disturbing routines. At dawn, he would dig in the soil, not in the usual rows of his garden, but in deep, narrow holes that seemed odd. Each hole stood straight, narrow like a tiny coffin. At dusk, he returned to the house, silent, unchanging, a shadow among shadows. No one could understand him, yet everyone sensed the intensity behind his stillness. The father's silence was not mere absence of speech. It was a language of grief and obsession, one that communicated volumes to anyone paying attention. Fear and curiosity intertwined, leaving villagers awake at night, imagining horrors that may or may not exist. Priests and investigators tried to break the silence. They knocked, they begged, they implored him to explain. Sometimes, he would open the door and allow them a glimpse of the children's rooms. Tiny shoes lined the floor. Small beds stood empty. Toys lay scattered, covered in dust. He never spoke, but the message was clear. The children were gone, and the world had nothing to offer in their place. And yet, the father's silence was not just about grief. It was a warning. Something in the way he moved, the way he buried, and the way he refused to speak told the village that his actions were deliberate. There was intention in the stillness, as if the standing graves themselves were part of a language no one else could read. The more the villagers tried to pry, the more fear took hold. Even those who had been closest to the family felt a chill when they crossed the threshold of the father's home. It was a silence that demanded respect, a silence that carried its own story, a story of loss, guilt, and something darker still, waiting beneath the surface. By the time the first investigator left, they had learned one thing. The father's silence was more terrifying than any confession. It was a barrier, a shadow that would not lift, a prelude to horrors the village could not yet name. When the villagers finally saw the graves, the world seemed to shift. What they had feared, whispered about, and avoided in hushed tones was real. And it was worse than anyone could imagine. The children's graves were not like the others. They stood upright, narrow mounds of earth as if the soil itself had been commanded to rise. Wooden crosses jutted into the sky like thin, pleading fingers. In the pale morning light, they seemed almost alive, silent sentinels in the frozen cemetery. People recoiled. Some vomited. Others simply sank to their knees, staring at the unnatural rows, trying to make sense of them. The standing graves challenged everything the villagers knew about life, death, and grief. How could a father, even one drowning in sorrow, bury his own children in such a twisted manner? The graveyard had always been a place of peace. Old oaks shaded the paths. Moss covered the stones like a gentle blanket. But the father's handiwork disrupted this tranquility. It was as though the earth itself had been defied. The ground no longer lay flat. It trembled with a story of obsession, despair, and horror. When investigators measured the graves, they found them narrow and deep, just wide enough to hold a child. The soil was packed tightly around each body, almost as if someone had wanted them to stand forever, to resist the decay that claimed all life. It was meticulous, methodical, and chilling. The villagers murmured about the night it must have taken, how the father labored in silence, perhaps by candlelight, under the weight of grief. The wind would have carried only the faintest sound of shovel against dirt, yet fear whispered that the earth remembered every movement, every heartbeat. Some began to claim the graves were cursed. Flowers placed by the cemetery gate withered overnight. Animals refused to enter the plot. And always the father watched. Standing in the shadows, he made no motion, offered no explanation. His presence made the standing graves feel alive, as if they were an extension of him, a monument not just to his children, but to his own inner darkness. The priest, an old man who had buried generations in the village, knelt by one of the upright mounds and whispered prayers that felt hollow even as they left his lips. He had never seen anything like it. Even the oldest tombs, some dating back decades, seemed more comforting than this unnatural arrangement. Neighbors tried to peek from their windows, but each glimpse sent shivers down their spines. At night, the wind through the upright graves moaned like crying children. Shadows stretched unnaturally, flickering in the dim moonlight. Some claimed the crosses whispered secrets to each other, sharing the father's grief in a language only they could understand. Visitors who approached too closely felt dizzy, nauseous, and desperate to leave. The father's obsession had changed the cemetery into a place of living terror. And yet, no one could tear their eyes away. Something about the standing graves demanded acknowledgement, as if they were both a warning and a question. What had driven a man to such extremes? Could grief alone shape the earth to this grotesque pattern? Or was there something darker at play, something human minds could not comprehend? The village knew one truth for certain. The standing graves were more than a burial. They were a message, and it was one they would spend the rest of their lives trying to decode. The house that once rang with laughter and small footsteps now stood silent. Windows were shuttered, doors locked, and the air inside felt heavy, as though the walls themselves mourned. Grief had seeped into every corner, settling over furniture, toys, and broken dreams. The mother wandered through the rooms like a ghost, touching the children's belongings without really seeing them. Tiny shoes sat in the hallway. Dolls with cracked faces stared silently from shelves. Every object was a reminder of what was gone. And yet, she said nothing. Words had failed her long before the tragedy, replaced by tears that never stopped falling. The father moved differently now, as though the weight of the world had bent him into someone unrecognizable. His hands, once steady and warm, trembled as he carried water or chopped wood. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was in fragments, a single word here, a name there. Villagers noticed the change immediately. The man they had known, quiet, yes but alive, was gone, replaced by a figure consumed entirely by obsession and sorrow. Neighbors whispered about the fracture in the family, noting how each member existed in their own private hell. Even the smallest gestures of affection had disappeared. No one could remember the last time they saw the parents speak to each other without tension, anger, or despair lingering between them. The household had become a graveyard for relationships as well as children. The mother's despair took on strange patterns. She would light candles in the children's rooms, arranging them in circles or lines that made little sense to anyone else. Sometimes she would hum songs softly, songs that seemed half remembered and half invented, as though calling the children back from somewhere unseen. The villagers called it madness, though they couldn't imagine the depth of loss that had driven her there. Even the simplest routines became nightmarish. Meals were left untouched. Laundry hung in the yard, forgotten in the frost. The garden, once meticulously cared for, was overgrown and wild. Time itself seemed to stretch and bend inside the house, leaving both parents suspended in a state of relentless mourning. Visitors who dared enter noticed the tension, the palpable grief that clung to the air. The father's silence pressed down on them. The mother's hollow eyes followed their every move. It was as though the house had absorbed the tragedy and refused to let go, a living monument to loss and sorrow. Family friends tried to offer help, food, advice, comfort, but the parents would accept nothing. Pride, guilt, or shame kept them locked in their private torment. The villagers grew cautious, avoiding the home except when absolutely necessary, afraid that the sorrow would reach out and drag them into its depth. Yet the tragedy did not end with the parents. The extended family, too, felt the ripple effects. Siblings, cousins, and neighbors carried a heavy burden of guilt and helplessness. Each funeral, each glance at the standing graves, reminded them that life could shatter in an instant, leaving only silence and unanswered questions. This family, once ordinary, was now a cautionary tale. It was a study in grief taken to its absolute extreme, a household transformed into a living portrait of despair, a story that would haunt the village for generations. In the cold Bohemian winter, the house whispered a singular truth: some tragedies do not heal. They linger, bending time, twisting hearts, and leaving nothing but shadows behind. Fear has a way of bending reality. In Bohemia, after the children's standing graves were discovered, whispers of the supernatural spread faster than truth. People spoke in hushed tones of curses, restless spirits, and omens that no one could explain. It started with the wind. On quiet nights, villagers claimed to hear the soft cries of children carried from the cemetery, echoing through the streets. Doors slammed without cause. Shadows moved against walls where no light fell. Animals became restless, refusing to enter the father's yard or the graveyard. Even the river seemed to flow differently, slower, heavier, as if carrying sorrow downstream. Some swore the father had summoned dark forces, that his grief had turned into something unholy. They recalled his silent walks at dusk, the strange patterns of soil in the children's graves, and the obsessive care with which he tended them. The standing graves were no longer just a testament to loss. They were a warning, a mark that death could not contain what had been unleashed. Priests visited often, performing rituals and prayers to ward off evil. They sprinkled holy water, recited incantations, and blessed the earth, yet nothing seemed to change. Candles burned down to stubs without explanation. Night after night, the cries continued, fading only when the first light of dawn touched the hills. Villagers whispered of figures glimpsed in windows, shadowy shapes of children standing, staring, their faces pale and eyes wide. Those brave enough to follow the shapes into the yard found only empty space, footprints frozen in the frost that led nowhere. Fear twisted imagination into reality. Every creaking floorboard became a footstep, every flickering candle a message. Superstitions grew. Mothers covered mirrors in children's rooms, fearing the reflection might summon spirits. Farmers avoided fields near the graveyard, claiming crops withered if they worked too close to the standing graves. Some even refused to walk past the father's home after sunset, believing his grief had created a boundary between the living and something else. At night, the wind seemed alive, whispering stories of the dead. It carried tales of loss, of grief unspoken, of rituals performed in silence. Every howl through the trees became a voice crying for justice, or perhaps for vengeance. The village became a place suspended between two worlds, caught in the tension between what was natural and what might be supernatural. Even the father seemed to acknowledge it. He spent hours at the graveyard, sometimes kneeling, sometimes standing, speaking softly into the night. No one knew if he was pleading for forgiveness, commanding spirits, or simply mourning in a language only he could understand. His presence reinforced the belief that the supernatural was not just imagined. It was real, tangible, and terrifying. By the time winter deepened, the stories had grown. The standing graves had become the epicenter of a haunted village, where silence carried warnings, shadows held memories, and grief could twist into something no human mind could fully explain. And through it all, the wind whispered on, carrying the voice of lost children and a father whose silence spoke louder than any curse could. The arrival of outsiders brought both relief and unease to the village. Priests, Journalists and local authorities came to uncover the truth, but the stories they carried only deepened the shadow over Bohemia. Each step they took on the frost-covered streets was watched by wary eyes, every question answered with silence or averted gaze. The father remained elusive. He opened the door, nodded once, and retreated. Investigators followed footprints to the standing graves, examined the meticulous arrangement of earth and wood, and measured the depth of each narrow grave. Nothing about the scene was ordinary. Nothing could explain the obsessive precision of a man whose grief had twisted into ritual. Journalists scribbled notes furiously, trying to capture the horror in words. Photographers snapped pictures of the upright mounds, but even the camera lenses seemed unable to contain the unnaturalness of it all. The graves appeared taller, more menacing, more alive than any image could convey. The priests attempted rituals of blessing, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers for the dead. Yet, the father did not participate, standing apart with a calm so chilling it silenced the churchmen. They began to suspect his silence was intentional, a shield against their intrusion, or perhaps a reflection of some inner darkness too vast to measure. Villagers observed from a distance, torn between hope and fear. They wanted someone to explain, to reason, to fix what had been broken. But the investigators offered only fragmented answers, partial observations, and more questions. Every line of inquiry seemed to unravel, exposing new layers of mystery that deepened the horror instead of alleviating it. One journalist, brave or foolish enough, asked the mother about her children. She stared at him with hollow eyes, trembling, and whispered fragments of names that no one could piece together. The father remained silent nearby, his presence a living warning. Even the professionals could not ignore the palpable tension, the sense that they had entered a space where grief had hardened into something almost sacred and almost dangerous. Rumors spread rapidly. Some claimed the standing graves were a message, a warning, or an act of defiance against death itself. Others suspected the father had been influenced by something unseen, some force older and darker than human comprehension. Even the most rational minds felt the tug of superstition, the weight of the village's unspoken fears. Investigators documented everything meticulously. Notes filled journals, sketches lined pages, photographs captured details, yet failed to capture the essence of the horror. They could measure the graves, record the layout, and catalog the evidence, but they could not measure grief, despair, or the unnatural resolve that had shaped the father's actions. By the time the outsiders left, Bohemia was no longer the same village. The story of the standing graves spread beyond its borders, whispered in newspapers and letters, carried by travelers. And yet, the father remained, a silent sentinel at the edge of the graveyard, his presence a living reminder that some tragedies defy explanation. The village had been observed, measured, and written about, but no investigation could truly unravel the human element. Grief, obsession, and a father's unbreakable, haunting silence. It came on a night thick with fog, when the village streets were empty and the wind carried a bitter chill. The father finally spoke. One word at first, trembling, almost lost in the dark. Then another, and slowly, a story unfolded, a story more horrifying than anyone had imagined. He confessed that his grief had become unbearable, that the loss of his children had hollowed him out, leaving a void he could not endure. He had buried them upright because he could not accept their absence. Standing, he said, they might resist death. Standing, they might remind him that they were still here, somehow, somewhere. The villagers listened, some frozen in disbelief, others trembling with a mix of sorrow and fear. The father's voice was calm now, eerily so, yet every word carried a weight that pressed against the heart. He described the meticulous digging, the long nights under candlelight, and the obsession that had driven him to defy the earth itself. It was the only way, he whispered, eyes hollow yet unflinching. They had to stand. They had to watch. They had to be remembered always. Each sentence seemed to echo across the cemetery, bouncing off the upright graves like a whispered incantation. The confession revealed layers of anguish and madness. He had been tormented by visions, dreams of the children, pleading, crying, reaching for him. He had feared forgetting them, feared that the world would swallow their memory. In his mind, the standing graves were a monument, a defiance, a desperate attempt to hold the past in the present. Priests who had attempted to offer comfort found themselves recoiling. The confession was not merely a tale of grief. It was a map of obsession, a guide into the darkest corners of the human soul. They murmured prayers, though they felt them hollow. Nothing could undo the years of silent torment, the ritualized defiance of mortality, or the haunting presence of the graves themselves. Journalists recorded every word, their pens shaking. Every sentence carried the scent of madness wrapped in sorrow. Every pause a reminder of the father's unrelenting silence that had preceded this revelation. Even rational minds struggled to process the logic of grief twisted into ritual, of love that had hardened into obsession. Neighbors, too, were shaken. For years, they had whispered, watched, and feared. And now, hearing the father's reasoning, they realized the depth of the darkness that had lived among them. It was not just sorrow. It was a consuming force, capable of bending reality, compelling the earth itself to obey the will of one desperate man. Some believed the confession explained everything. Others feared it was only the surface. How much of his mind had been consumed by something beyond human understanding? Could grief alone compel such acts? Or had he crossed into something unnatural? As the night deepened, the father returned to the graveyard, standing among the upright graves, his words lingering in the fog. The village understood, then, that the story did not end with the confession. It would echo forever, carried by wind, shadow, and soil. The children remained standing, silent witnesses to a father's obsession, and the memory of that night would haunt Bohemia for generations. The confession spread through Bohemia like wildfire. By morning, the village was alive with whispers, fear, and disbelief. People gathered in small groups, exchanging versions of the story, embellishing some details, suppressing others. The father's actions became a specter that hung over every street, every home, every conversation. Families who had once walked freely through the village now avoided the graveyard entirely. Children were kept inside, doors were bolted before sunset, and windows shuttered against the unknown. Mothers clutched their young ones, trembling at every gust of wind or flicker of candlelight. The standing graves had transformed from a private tragedy into a public nightmare. Some villagers reacted with pity, though even that was tinged with fear. They sympathized with the father, recognizing the unbearable weight of grief, yet recoiled from the method, the obsession, and the silence that had preceded it. Others reacted with anger, blaming him for shattering the community's sense of safety, turning the cemetery into a place of dread. Rumors and conspiracy theories flourished. Some claimed the father had been possessed, influenced by forces beyond comprehension. Others whispered of curses laid upon the family, of sins that demanded ritualized punishment. Every version of the story carried its own terror, feeding a growing sense of unease. Priests held emergency gatherings, attempting to reassure the villagers. They performed blessings, organized prayers, and counseled families to remain calm. Yet even the clergy felt the weight of the horror. The standing graves defied tradition, reason, and comfort. They were a monument not only to the children's deaths, but to grief transformed into something unearthly. Journalists and outsiders continued to arrive, drawn by the story, documenting every detail with a mix of fascination and horror. Letters sent to newspapers carried sensationalized accounts, spreading the tale far beyond Bohemia. The village became a place of legend, whispered about in towns and cities across the region. Some residents tried to reclaim normalcy, attempting to resume work, school, and social gatherings. But the father's presence, the standing graves, and the pervasive sense of dread made normal life impossible. Even the wind seemed heavier, laden with whispers of the past, as though the village itself mourned alongside the grieving family. A few brave souls attempted to speak with the father again, seeking closure or understanding. Each encounter left them shaken. His eyes, hollow and distant, held a depth of sorrow and resolve that defied explanation. The town realized that no words could bridge the chasm created by grief and obsession. By the end of winter, the village had changed. Fear had become routine. Silence had a weight, and the standing graves remained, witnesses to both the tragedy and the town's inability to comprehend it fully. Bohemia had survived, but it would never be the same. The story of the father and his upright children became a cautionary tale, a legend whispered across generations, warning that grief, when twisted, could reach beyond the personal and claim the world around it. Every family has secrets. Some are small, harmless, quietly tucked away in drawers or whispered in passing. But the father's family held shadows that ran deeper, darker, and far older than anyone in the village could have imagined. Investigators, journalists, and even the villagers themselves began piecing together a history that had been hidden under polite smiles and nods. The father's ancestors had lived in Bohemia for generations, their lives marked by tragedy, loss, and whispered scandals. Tales of sudden deaths, disappearances, and unexplainable misfortune haunted the family tree, passed down like an inheritance more than a memory. Old neighbors recalled incidents from decades past, children vanishing for hours only to return silent and withdrawn, inexplicable illnesses that struck families, livestock found dead under mysterious circumstances. Some said the family was cursed. Others whispered that a darker force followed them, feeding on grief and obsession. The father's childhood was no less shadowed. Accounts emerged of a lonely boy, silenced by fear and strict discipline, left to wander the woods and fields alone for hours. Teachers remembered him as quiet, almost unnervingly so, a child with intense focus and sudden, unpredictable bursts of emotion. In hindsight, these fragments painted a portrait of a man shaped by isolation, sorrow, and fear long before the tragedy of his own children. Neighbors began speaking in hushed tones about arguments between the father's parents, loud, secretive, and often unresolved. Some claimed the mother of his youth practiced strange rituals, burning herbs and murmuring incantations late at night. Others insisted these stories were exaggeration, but combined with the standing graves, they formed a pattern no one could ignore. Even the mother, quiet and withdrawn, carried traces of the past. Letters surfaced, diaries discovered tucked behind floorboards, filled with grief, guilt, and fear that seemed almost prophetic. She wrote of restless nights, ominous dreams, and a pervasive sense that something terrible was inevitable. Her words now read like warnings, lost for decades, only to resurface too late. The villagers realized that the tragedy of the standing graves was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of decades of silence, secrets, and unresolved grief. The father's actions, shocking as they were, fit into a larger story, one where sorrow could twist, bend, and eventually break even the strongest human mind. Even outsiders felt the weight of these revelations. The newspapers carried fragments, but words could not capture the oppressive sense of history that clung to every corner of the village, the family home, and the cemetery itself. Each detail, the upright graves, the father's silence, the mother's hollow eyes, was part of a long, dark legacy. By the time winter thawed into spring, the villagers understood the truth. The standing graves were not just a product of one man's grief. They were the latest chapter in a story of inherited sorrow, unresolved trauma, and secrets that had festered for generations. The past had buried itself upright in the present, refusing to lie down quietly, demanding attention, recognition, and fear. Bohemia had seen darkness before, but never like this. And as the wind whispered through the cemetery, carrying the faintest echoes of old voices, the villagers realized that some secrets never truly die. They wait, patient and silent, until grief and obsession awaken them again. Years passed, but the story of the standing graves never faded. The father remained in the village, a shadow among shadows, and the cemetery stood as a constant reminder of grief transformed into obsession. His silence became legendary, a presence more powerful than any words could convey. The villagers learned to live alongside it. Children were born and raised knowing the story, and every parent warned their own that grief, when left unchecked, could consume the soul. The upright graves became a pilgrimage of sorts, a place where the living measured their own resilience against the horror of loss. The father's presence never lessened the impact. Even in old age, he walked the cemetery paths at dusk, eyes hollow but alert, standing beside the children he had buried upright. Visitors often glimpsed him, silent, a living monument to grief, obsession, and the human capacity to defy nature itself. Stories spread beyond Bohemia, carried by letters, newspapers, and word of mouth. Scholars and journalists debated the meaning of the graves, the psychology of the father, and the strange rituals of mourning. Yet, no one could truly grasp the depths of the silence that had begun in that house and spread to the village, touching every life with fear, respect, and sorrow. The mother, broken and withdrawn, eventually passed quietly, her death almost unnoticed. Her diaries, however, remained, preserved by neighbors who feared to burn them. They were full of fragmented prayers, whispered regrets, and glimpses of the horror that had shaped their family. For generations, they served as a warning. Grief that is ignored, repressed, or twisted can become a force beyond reason. Even decades later, the standing graves remained upright. Time and weather could not topple them. Moss crept along the wooden crosses, frost-etched patterns in the soil, but the graves endured, silent witnesses to the tragedy, the confession, and the legacy of silence. The village changed around them. New houses rose, roads widened, and modernity crept slowly into Bohemia. Yet, the cemetery resisted. It remained a place where silence carried weight, where shadows seemed thicker, and where the past refused to rest. Parents still warned their children, travelers still avoided the path at night, and the wind continued to whisper stories of grief and obsession long after the father had gone. In the end, the standing graves became more than a memorial. They were a testament to human sorrow, a symbol of how grief can transcend reason, and a reminder that some actions, driven by love, loss, and despair, can leave echoes that last far longer than life itself. Bohemia learned, in the most haunting way possible, that silence is not empty. It speaks, it warns, it endures, and sometimes it stands upright in the earth, watching, waiting, never letting go.